Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to today's story. A story of secrets, power, and unexpected twists. This one is going to leave you speechless. It's not just another dinner. It's a clash of identities that no one saw coming to in the heart of the city. In one of the most exclusive restaurants in town, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The air was thick with power, money, and the weight of unspoken hierarchies. At a long, polished table, a group of well-dressed individuals shared glasses of vintage wine and murmured about deals that could change the course of their lives. In the middle of it all, sitting like a shadow among the gleaming crystal and silverware, was a woman no one paid attention to, the waitress. Naomi Brooks, a young black woman, was working yet another shift at the upscale restaurant, her uniform spotless, her demeanor calm, and her eyes sharp. She had been invisible her entire life, but that night, everything would change. Little did anyone know, Naomi wasn't just the woman serving drinks and clearing plates. She was carrying a secret, one that would soon shatter the calm of this high society dinner. As the clinking of glasses and soft jazz music filled the room, no one noticed the quiet but intense exchange happening right before their eyes. It all started when a mafia boss, Richard Romano, a man known for his ruthlessness, leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room with an air of superiority. He smirked at his guests, enjoying the power he wielded over the negotiations at the table. He was a man who always got what he wanted, using fear, wealth, and influence to bend others to his will. His eyes landed on Naomi, who was moving gracefully around the table, refilling glasses and offering polite smiles. His sneer grew as he observed her, dismissing her as just another employee who didn't belong in this world. Richard, with his cold and calculating gaze, was the type of man who never spared a second thought for those beneath him. As Naomi approached his mother, a frail woman sitting quietly next to him, Richard couldn't help but make a comment, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Do you think she even speaks a word of Italian?" he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. Naomi's hand froze for a moment as she reached for the wine bottle, her face betraying no emotion. She had heard it all before. The looks, the whispers, the assumptions. But tonight, she would no longer remain silent. She wasn't just a waitress. Naomi's mind was sharp, her understanding of language profound. What Richard didn't know was that Naomi spoke fluent Italian, a skill passed down to her from her grandmother. It wasn't something she advertised. It wasn't something anyone would expect from a young woman working as a waitress. But when she heard Richard's dismissive words, something inside her shifted. She was no longer going to let him define who she was. Naomi turned to Richard's mother, who was sitting quietly, her eyes tired and a little distant. Naomi smiled softly, and in perfect Italian, greeted her, "Buonasera, signora. How are you this evening?" The words hung in the air for a brief moment. The room went silent. Richard's eyes widened, his face momentarily losing its confident smirk. His mother, who had been ignored and overlooked all evening, looked up at Naomi in shock, her face lighting up with recognition and warmth. Naomi didn't just speak the words. She had reached out to a woman who had been unseen, just like her. The mafia boss, once so sure of his control, now looked dumbfounded. His eyes flickered between Naomi and his mother, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. Naomi stood there, poised, her heart steady, as the silence stretched on. She had made her move, and it had left him speechless. A simple greeting, in a language that no one expected her to know, had just shifted the entire power dynamic in the room. The room, once filled with the sound of soft laughter and clinking glasses, was now hushed. Naomi's actions had exposed something deeper than just language. She had shattered the illusion of power that Richard had so carefully constructed. The question that everyone was thinking now was simple. Who was the real power in this room? And Richard Romano, the mafia boss, would have to come to terms with the answer. His reaction would determine whether he would continue to rule with arrogance or whether he would recognize the quiet strength of the woman who had just changed everything. As Naomi stood there, Her eyes locked on Richard Romano, the Mafia Boss. Something in the room shifted. The air, once filled with the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses, was now thick with tension. Richard, still sitting at the head of the table, was stunned, unable to process what had just happened. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow and a sense of confusion. The powerful man, who had just moments ago dismissed Naomi with a glance, was now at a loss for words. Naomi, on the other hand, stood tall, her posture unwavering. She had done something no one expected, something that went beyond mere language. It was more than speaking Italian. It was about reclaiming her space, her identity, and her voice in a room that had tried to ignore her. The other guests, who had been too preoccupied with their own affairs, slowly began to notice the change. Whispers spread like wildfire across the table. Some couldn't believe it, while others were left speechless. Naomi's simple act of speaking Italian to Richard's mother had turned the tables, shifting the dynamics of power in the room. Richard, still struggling to recover, glanced over at his mother. Her eyes, once filled with indifference, were now shining with a kind of recognition and gratitude. She reached out and gently touched Naomi's hand, her fingers trembling with emotion. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't react to the attention. Her eyes remained focused on Richard, waiting for him to process what had just happened. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Richard to make his move. Richard sat up straighter, his arrogance slowly creeping back into his posture. He cleared his throat and forced a smile, but it was weak, almost as if he were trying to convince himself that he was still in control. "Impressive," he said, his voice low and laced with a hint of sarcasm. "I didn't know we had such talent among the help." Naomi didn't flinch at his words. She simply nodded, acknowledging the comment without giving it the weight it hoped to carry. She had already won. Richard's attempt to regain control only further exposed his insecurity. He had underestimated her, just like he had done countless others before. But Naomi wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to serve him or anyone else. She was here to show them that she was more than they could ever imagine. The moment passed, and the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. Naomi had made her mark. The energy in the room was different now. It wasn't just about the business deal anymore. It was about respect, and Naomi had earned it in a way that no one could have predicted. As the dinner continued, Richard's demeanor shifted. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that he had lost something, but he didn't know how to get it back. He tried to refocus on the deal, but his mind kept drifting back to Naomi. How had she done it? How had she turned the tables on him with nothing more than a few words in a language he had assumed she didn't understand? He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, a feeling he wasn't used to. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every conversation. But Naomi had made him question everything. It wasn't just the language or the fact that she had spoken to his mother in a way that no one had bothered to do before. It was the quiet strength she had shown, the confidence in her silence. Naomi had stood her ground without needing to raise her voice or make a scene. She had won by simply being herself, and that was something Richard couldn't ignore. As the night wore on, Naomi's presence lingered in the air, even when she wasn't in the room. The guests at the table, once indifferent, now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Some couldn't help but wonder what else Naomi was capable of, what other surprises she might have hidden beneath the surface. But Richard, the man who had thought he had all the answers, found himself wondering something he had never considered before. Who was Naomi really, and what did she want? Naomi, for her part, continued to move through the evening with grace. She served the guests with the same quiet professionalism as before, but there was a difference now. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the woman in the background. She had stepped into the spotlight, and there was no going back. As the night drew to a close, Richard found himself facing a choice. He could continue to dismiss Naomi, to see her as just another employee, or he could acknowledge the truth that had been laid bare before him. Naomi wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had earned his respect, whether he liked it or not. And in that moment, Richard realized something he had never truly understood. True power wasn't about wealth or control. It was about presence, about knowing who you were and owning it. Naomi had shown him that, and it was a lesson he would never forget. As the night wore on, The tension in the room never quite dissipated. The guests continued their conversations, but Naomi could sense that something had shifted. Richard Romano, the mafia boss who had been so confident and in control just hours ago, now seemed restless. His movements were sharp, his words more clipped, and his once imposing presence now felt a bit smaller. It wasn't just the business deal that was on his mind anymore, it was her. Naomi, the woman who had turned his world upside down with nothing more than a few words. As the evening came to a close, Naomi made her way around the room, serving drinks and clearing plates with her usual poise. But this time, there was an undercurrent of respect in the air. She wasn't just the waitress. She was the woman who had made the mafia boss pause. The woman who had made everyone in the room question their assumptions. Richard couldn't stop thinking about her. He had dealt with powerful men and women, people who ruled empires, who had the wealth to buy anything they desired, but none of them had ever made him feel the way Naomi did. She had spoken to his mother in Italian, a language he had assumed she didn't understand, and in doing so, she had shattered the illusion of control he had worked so hard to build. Naomi didn't need to flaunt her intelligence or assert her authority. She didn't have to say anything to make him respect her. She simply stood her ground, and in doing so, she had claimed a power that he could not ignore. As the final moments of the evening approached, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He had always been the one who dictated the terms, who held the power in any room. But now, he couldn't help but feel as if the balance had shifted. Naomi had made him question everything he thought he knew about power, about control, and about respect. When the dinner finally came to an end, Richard stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the polished floor. The room grew quiet as he walked over to Naomi, who was finishing up the last of her duties for the night. She stood by the door, her back straight, her eyes focused on the task at hand, but when Richard approached, she looked up at him, her expression neutral but watchful. He cleared his throat, feeling a strange sense of hesitation in his chest, something he wasn't used to. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, acknowledging his words without making a big deal of it. There was no need for flattery or gratitude. Richard's words weren't what mattered. It was the power dynamic he had just realized had shifted. Richard had always believed that power was something you could command, something you could take by force. But Naomi had shown him that power was also about presence, about knowing who you were and owning it, even when others tried to ignore you. He had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated many others in his life. But Naomi wasn't like the others. She wasn't looking for approval or validation. She had already taken what she needed, respect. As Richard stood there, his words hanging in the air, Naomi took a step toward him, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't need to say anything else. Her presence alone spoke volumes. She turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing there, watching her go. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It wasn't about making a grand statement. It was about quietly asserting her place in a world that had always tried to dismiss her. Naomi had made her mark, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The next morning, as Richard sat in his office, going over the details of the deal that had brought him to this point, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The deal would go through, as planned, but it would never feel the same. Naomi had shown him something that no amount of money or power could ever give him: humility. He couldn't get her out of his mind, and he knew that he would never look at the world, or the people in it, the same way again. The days that followed the dinner were a blur for Naomi. The restaurant remained as busy as ever, the clinking of glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, and the soft, ambient music filling the space, but everything felt different. For the first time in a long while, Naomi found herself noticed. It wasn't the way she had expected. There were no grand gestures or accolades, but something had changed. Richard Romano, the mafia boss, had left a mark on her that night, just as she had left one on him. Naomi hadn't expected the dinner to have such an impact. She had simply been doing her job, serving with the quiet grace she always did. But somehow, in a room full of power, she had commanded attention in a way that no one else had. As she went about her daily duties, her mind kept returning to that moment when she had spoken to Richard's mother in Italian. It wasn't just the words that had caused the shift, it was what they represented. Naomi had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her place in a world that had tried to ignore her. Richard, meanwhile, had spent the days after the dinner in a haze of confusion. His business deal was moving forward, just as planned, but something felt off. He couldn't shake the image of Naomi standing tall, unwavering in the face of his mockery. He had always prided himself on being the one in control, but Naomi had shattered that illusion. It was more than the fact that she had spoken a language he assumed she didn't know. It was the quiet strength she had shown. No flashy gestures, no grand speeches, just her presence, her composure, and her confidence. It was the kind of power Richard couldn't ignore. Late one afternoon, several days after the dinner, Richard found himself in the lobby of the restaurant again. He had been in meetings all day, but his mind kept drifting. Back to Naomi. He hadn't planned it, but there he was, walking through the familiar doors of the Bayou Spoon, looking for something he couldn't quite name. He scanned the room briefly, and there she was, standing by the counter, exchanging a quiet word with a guest. She was poised, efficient, moving with a sense of purpose that seemed to draw the attention of everyone around her. Yet still, she remained humble, unnoticed by those who didn't truly see her. Richard stood at the entrance for a moment, watching her. He wasn't sure what had drawn him there, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to speak with her. He didn't know what he was going to say, or even if she would want to hear him out, but he felt an overwhelming urge to do something he had never done before: acknowledge her. Slowly, he made his way toward her, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor, his heart beating faster than he liked to admit. Naomi, sensing his presence, turned to face him as he approached. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that told Richard she hadn't forgotten their last encounter. "I didn't expect to see you here," Naomi said, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. Richard hesitated for a moment, then nodded, unsure of how to start. "I've been thinking a lot about the other night," he said, his voice surprisingly quiet. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "You've got something that I've spent my entire life chasing," Richard continued. "Control, power, influence. But you don't seem to need any of it." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "You think I don't need power?" she asked, her tone a mixture of amusement and challenge. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone," Richard said, his voice soft but firm. "But I do want to understand something. What did I miss? Why did you say what you said to my mother?" Naomi took a step closer to him, her posture relaxed, but her presence commanding. "I said what I said because it was the right thing to do," she replied simply. "Your mother has been ignored, dismissed, and treated as an afterthought for far too long. I saw her. I respected her." Richard stood still, processing her words. He had thought Naomi was just another waitress, another face in the crowd, but now he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to be subservient. She was here to be seen. The weight of his realization hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi broke the silence, her voice softer now. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for her. And for me." Richard nodded, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. He had spent so much time trying to manipulate the world around him, using his power to bend others to his will. But Naomi had shown him a different kind of strength, a quiet resilience that didn't need to dominate. She didn't need anyone's approval, least of all his. She had already found her place. "I get it now," Richard said quietly. "You've earned your respect. You didn't need to demand it. You just took it." Naomi smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of understanding, a smile that said she had already won, even before Richard had figured it out. "You don't need to understand everything," she said softly. "Sometimes, it's enough to just let people be who they are." Richard stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had thought he was the one with all the answers, the one in control, but Naomi had proven him wrong. And in that moment, he realized that the true power wasn't in money or control. It was in the quiet moments when people found their own strength, their own voice. And for the first time in his life, Richard Romano found himself looking at the world in a completely different way. Days passed since that fateful evening at the Bayou Spoon, but the impact of that night lingered like the hum of a distant storm. Naomi continued her work at the restaurant, moving with her usual grace and quiet confidence. But there was a new energy in the air. She wasn't invisible anymore. Every movement, every word seemed to carry weight, a weight that hadn't been there before. Richard Romano had left a mark on her, but she had left a deeper one on him. Naomi had never been one to seek attention, but now, something had changed. She wasn't just another waitress. She was a woman who had taken control of her own narrative, and the world around her was starting to notice. Meanwhile, Richard found himself caught in a cycle of reflection. His days were filled with meetings, deals, and business negotiations, yet his mind kept drifting back to Naomi. She was still there, in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of a moment he couldn't forget. He had lived his life by a simple rule: power is everything. But Naomi had made him question that belief. She had proven to him that true strength didn't come from dominating others or controlling every situation. True strength came from standing firm in your own identity, from having the courage to speak your truth, even when the world tried to dismiss you. It was a lesson he had never expected to learn from a waitress. And now, with each passing day, that lesson seemed to grow louder in his ears. Richard tried to shake it off, to bury it beneath his work, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He had underestimated Naomi, and in doing so, he had uncovered something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. She had earned his respect, without even trying. Richard's mind kept returning to the dinner, to the moment when Naomi had spoken to his mother in Italian. It had been a simple act, but it had shattered the illusion of control he had so carefully built, and it had humbled him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Naomi had made him realize that there was more to power than money and influence. There was also grace, humility, and the ability to see others for who they truly were. Richard hadn't known what to do with that realization, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed to speak to Naomi again. He couldn't leave it like this. So, one afternoon, after another round of back-to-back meetings, Richard found himself walking through the familiar doors of the Bayou Spoon once more. He hadn't planned it, but there he was, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. Naomi was behind the counter, taking orders and chatting with a few regulars, her demeanor as calm and collected as ever. She looked up as he approached, her eyes steady, waiting for him to speak. "Naomi," Richard began, his voice a little softer than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. To me, about power, about respect." Naomi raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I never really understood it," Richard admitted, his tone almost reflective. "I thought power was something you could take, something you could control. But after that night, after everything, I see it differently now." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable but attentive. "You've made me realize something important," Richard continued, his words measured, sincere. "True power isn't about control. It's about understanding. It's about seeing people for who they really are and respecting them, even when it's hard." Naomi's gaze softened, but she said nothing. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "And I've been wrong. About a lot of things. But especially about you." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. "I've spent my life thinking that power was all about wealth and influence," Richard said, his voice steady now. "But you've shown me that there's a different kind of power. A power that doesn't come from taking, but from giving. A power that comes from being true to yourself, no matter the circumstances." Naomi stood still, absorbing his words. She had heard many apologies in her life, but this one felt different. It wasn't the usual hollow attempt to smooth things over. This time, Richard seemed genuine. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was simply acknowledging the truth of what had happened. And Naomi appreciated that. She had never expected an apology from him, but hearing him admit his mistake meant more than any grand gesture could. For a moment, the restaurant was quiet, the hum of activity in the background seeming far away. Naomi looked at Richard, her eyes calm but sharp. "I don't need an apology," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't do it for you, Richard. I did it for me, for my own dignity, and for my mother." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I get it now," he said, his voice quiet but full of respect. "You don't need anyone's approval. You've earned your place, and you don't need to prove anything to anyone." Naomi smiled, a small but genuine smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of quiet acknowledgement. She had done what she needed to do, and that was enough. As Richard stood there, watching her, he realized that Naomi had already won, not by dominating, but by simply being herself. She had shown him that true strength comes not from control, but from authenticity. And in that moment, Richard Romano knew that he would never look at the world, or the people in it, the same way again. As the weeks passed, Naomi noticed a subtle shift in the way people treated her at the Bayou Spoon. The regulars, who had once ignored her, now acknowledged her with a nod or a smile. Even the new customers seemed to see her differently. It wasn't just about being a waitress anymore. It was about being Naomi, the woman who had stood up in a room full of powerful people and changed the course of a night with a single conversation. Richard, too, had not forgotten their interaction. Every time he passed the Bayou Spoon on his way to meetings, he found himself glancing at the restaurant, wondering if Naomi was inside. He knew it was more than just a casual curiosity. Something had shifted inside him. He had been living in a world of control and dominance, but Naomi had shown him a different side of life, a side that wasn't about taking what you could, but about giving respect and owning your truth. A week after their conversation, Richard found himself back at the Bayou Spoon. He wasn't sure what brought him there. He didn't need anything. No business, no deal. It was just a quiet pull, an unspoken desire to be in the same space as Naomi, the woman who had humbled him in the most unexpected way. The moment he entered, Naomi was behind the counter, her usual spot, making small talk with a regular. Her presence was calm but powerful, like she was in control of her own space, her own world. She didn't need to announce her power. It was already evident in the way she moved, the way she spoke, and the way she carried herself. Richard approached the counter, his footsteps hesitant but sure. Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Back again?" she asked, her voice light. But there was a glint of curiosity in her eyes. Richard nodded, his hands resting on the counter. "I'm starting to think you're the only place in town that actually knows what respect means," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Naomi raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You came all this way just to tell me that?" she asked, the question playful but with an undercurrent of seriousness. Richard leaned in slightly, his expression softening. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he admitted. "About everything you said, about the way you carry yourself. I've spent my whole life focusing on power and control, but I've never seen anything like the way you operate." Naomi didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to. Her silence, her composure, spoke volumes. Richard continued, his voice low but earnest. "I've always been the one in control, the one who sets the rules, but you don't need any of that. You've shown me that there's more to strength than just holding the reins." Naomi glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the customers, but she didn't break eye contact with Richard. "You're not the first person to learn that lesson," she said softly. "But you're one of the few who actually gets it." Richard smiled, the first genuine smile he had given in weeks. He had always been the one who made others bend to his will, but Naomi had made him see that true power was in choosing to step back, to let people be who they were without judgment or manipulation. "You've changed the way I see things," Richard said, his voice steady. "And I wanted to thank you for that. Not just for what you did for me, but for showing me that there's more to life than winning." Naomi nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about winning," she said, her tone calm. "It's about being true to yourself, no matter what the world tells you. I've spent years trying to make others see me, trying to prove my worth. But the moment I stopped trying to make them see me and just started being myself, that's when everything changed." Richard stood there for a moment, processing her words. He had always thought that power was something you could take, something you could claim by force. But Naomi had shown him that true power was quiet. It was internal, and it didn't need to be demanded. It was something that could be earned simply by being who you were, unapologetically. As he turned to leave, he looked back at Naomi, who was already moving on to her next task. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet understanding between them. Richard had learned something that night, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about respecting them, about giving them the space to be who they were. And in doing so, he had found a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on control, but on mutual respect and understanding. Weeks passed, and though life continued at the Bayou Spoon, Naomi's world had shifted in ways she hadn't expected. She found herself thinking about Richard Romano less and less. focusing instead on the new sense of peace that had taken root in her. There was a quiet confidence that came with being seen, not because someone decided to acknowledge her, but because she had decided to see herself. The world was a different place when you stopped waiting for others to define you, and Naomi had finally stopped waiting. Every day, she moved through her work with a calm efficiency, but there was a noticeable change in her. She didn't rush through her tasks. Instead, she approached everything with patience, as if time itself had slowed down to match her rhythm. The customers, too, noticed it. It wasn't just that she was good at her job, it was the way she carried herself. She wasn't invisible anymore. Richard, for his part, couldn't let go of the feeling Naomi had left him with. He had tried to move on with the business as usual, attending meetings, finalizing deals, but no matter how hard he tried to focus, his mind always wandered back to her. The lesson she had taught him wasn't just about respect. It was about something much deeper. He had spent his life building walls, creating a world where he could control everything and everyone. But Naomi had shown him that true strength came from letting go, from not needing to control everything. It was a lesson that was harder to accept than he had anticipated. He tried to shake it off. He had to keep up appearances, to maintain the facade of the powerful, ruthless CEO. But that lesson kept nagging at him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. One afternoon, Richard found himself walking through the familiar streets of the city, his mind drifting again to Naomi. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to visit the Bayou Spoon again. He had been there before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the fact that he wanted to see her again, to apologize in a way that didn't feel like he was trying to manipulate the situation. He just wanted to acknowledge her in a way that felt honest. As he stepped through the door, the familiar sights and sounds of the restaurant greeted him, but this time, there was a quiet anticipation in the air. Naomi was behind the counter, as always, interacting with customers, her eyes calm and focused. When she saw him walk in, she didn't miss a beat. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. There was no judgment in her gaze, no expectation. It was simply a moment between two people who had shared something more than words could express. Richard walked toward the counter, his footsteps steady, but the feeling of hesitation still lingered. He had been so sure of himself before, always the one who held the power, the one who dictated the terms. But now, in front of Naomi, he felt something he had never felt before, uncertainty. Naomi looked at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Back again?" she asked, her tone light, but with a depth that Richard could feel. He nodded, his voice a little softer than usual. "I've been thinking," he began, "about everything that happened between us. And I realized something. I never properly thanked you." Naomi raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Not for what you did for me," he said, "but for what you taught me." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes focused on him. "You taught me that power isn't about control," Richard said quietly. "It's about understanding. It's about recognizing that there's strength in letting go, in seeing people for who they truly are, not what you want them to be." Naomi didn't speak immediately. She simply listened, her expression calm. But there was something in the way she held herself that made Richard feel like he had finally understood something he had been too blind to see before. "I've spent my whole life building walls, thinking that I could control everything around me. But you showed me that true power isn't about controlling people. It's about respecting them, seeing them for who they are, and letting them be." Naomi nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "It's a hard lesson," she said softly. "But it's one you had to learn on your own. I can't teach you respect. You have to give it." Richard stood there for a moment, taking in her words. He had learned a lot from Naomi, but the most important lesson was the one he had learned about himself. He had spent years chasing power, thinking it was something that could be bought, earned, or taken. But Naomi had shown him that power wasn't something you could take at all. It was something you had to earn by simply being who you were. As Richard turned to leave, he looked back at Naomi, his eyes full of gratitude. He didn't need to say anything more. He had learned what he needed to, and now, it was time to move forward. Naomi watched him go, her expression thoughtful, but there was no regret, no bitterness. She had done what she needed to do, and now, she was free. As the days went on, Naomi found herself more at peace with the changes that had come into her life. Richard's visit had stirred something deep within her, but she didn't let it consume her. She had learned long ago that true power came not from clinging to the past, but from embracing the present moment. Every day at the Bayou Spoon, she worked with a quiet sense of fulfillment, no longer waiting for recognition or validation from anyone else. She had already given herself the one thing she had always craved: respect. Her work, once just a means to an end, had transformed into a reflection of her strength and character. The restaurant, which had once been just a place to work, now felt like her space, a space she had claimed for herself. Naomi continued to serve with the same grace and dedication, but now there was an undeniable confidence in the way she carried herself. The regulars at the restaurant began to take notice. They respected her not just for her skills, but for the way she held herself. Naomi had become more than a waitress in their eyes. She was a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, Richard had continued with his life, but Naomi remained on his mind. It wasn't just the lesson she had taught him about power and respect. It was her quiet strength, her ability to change the dynamic without saying a word. As much as he tried to move forward, something about Naomi had left an imprint on him. He had always thought he was the one in control, but Naomi had shown him that the strongest people didn't need to control anything. They just had to be themselves. After some time, Richard found himself back at the Bayou Spoon. It wasn't just the business deals or the money that had drawn him here. It was the feeling of wanting to connect, to acknowledge Naomi once again. He entered the familiar doors of the restaurant, his steps slower this time, more deliberate. Naomi was behind the counter, just as she had always been. This time, however, there was no tension between them, no need for grand gestures. She looked up as he approached, her eyes meeting his, steady and unflinching. "Back again?" Naomi asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Richard nodded, his expression calm but sincere. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, his tone quieter than usual, "for showing me something I hadn't seen before." Naomi raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "You showed me that strength doesn't come from taking control, it comes from letting go. It's about letting people be who they are, without trying to mold them into something they're not," he said, his voice steady and sure. Naomi smiled, not a smile of triumph, but one of understanding. "You get it now?" she said softly. Richard nodded. "I do." Naomi looked at him for a moment before speaking again, her voice thoughtful. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about you, about the choices you make. You have to decide who you want to be, and whether you're willing to respect others the way they deserve." Richard stood there for a moment, processing her words. Naomi had taught him a lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The lesson wasn't just about respect. It was about authenticity, about finding strength in vulnerability, and about letting go of the need to control. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt truly free. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Naomi simply nodded, her expression calm but warm. There was no need for more words between them. Richard had learned what he needed to, and he was ready to move forward. As he left the restaurant, the weight he had been carrying for so long seemed to lighten, and for the first time, he felt truly at peace with himself. Naomi, for her part, continued with her work, her presence as strong as ever. She hadn't needed anything from Richard. She had already given herself the one thing that mattered most: respect. And in that quiet strength, she had found everything she needed. As time passed, the Bayou Spoon remained a steady presence in Naomi's life, but she had long ago stopped looking for validation from anyone. She continued to serve with the same quiet grace, but now, there was a peace in her that hadn't existed before. She no longer measured her worth by the opinions of others or by the recognition she received. She knew who she was, and that was enough. The regulars at the restaurant continued to admire her, but they respected her for more than just her skills. They respected her strength, the way she held herself with quiet dignity. The room always felt a little warmer when Naomi was there, as if her presence brought a sense of calm that was rare in the fast-paced world around them. Richard, too, had found a sense of peace. His visits to the Bayou Spoon became less frequent, but every time he passed by, he felt a pull, a reminder of the lesson Naomi had taught him. He had long ago let go of his need to control everything, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable: respect. Naomi's influence on him had been profound, but it wasn't just about what she had taught him. It was about who she had shown him he could become. Naomi never sought anything from Richard. She had never needed his validation or approval. She had already built her own world, a world where she was free to be herself without apology. And in that freedom, she had found everything she needed. As for Richard, he no longer saw the world through the lens of power and control. He had learned that true strength came from being authentic, from treating others with respect, and from letting go of the need to dominate. Naomi had shown him the way, not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet strength of her presence. And for that, Richard would always be grateful. In the end, Naomi didn't need to change the world. She had already changed herself, and in doing so, she had shown everyone around her that the greatest power comes from within.